As World War II ended in 1945, a new kind of conflict emerged: the Cold War. Instead of direct military confrontation, it was a battle of ideologies, technology, influence, and fear between the two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It was democracy versus communism, capitalism versus state control, freedom versus oppression. At least how each side saw it. The rivalry would dominate American life politically, economically, socially for decades. You're listening to APush Through History, a resource designed to help students completing the course of AP US History. This episode covers the first subject of Period 8, 1945-1980, the chilly New World. Harry Truman had not expected to become president. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in April 1945, just months into his unprecedented fourth term and mere weeks before the end of World War II in Europe, Truman, FDR's relatively uninformed and recently appointed vice president, was suddenly thrust into the highest office in the land. Truman had not even been briefed on the Manhattan Project prior to the president's death. He assumed the presidency with little preparation, inheriting a nation emerging from global war and staring down the dawn of a new ideological and geopolitical conflict. Almost immediately, Truman faced two enormous challenges: maintaining the complex post-war transition at home and confronting the growing threat of Soviet communism abroad. Domestically, Truman sought to extend and solidify the legacy of Roosevelt's New Deal through his own legislative program, which he dubbed the Fair Deal. This agenda aimed to ensure a smooth return to a peacetime economy while expanding the social safety net for American citizens. Among its major components were calls to raise the federal minimum wage, expand Social Security benefits, fund national health insurance, invest in public housing, and support America's farmers. Several pieces of legislation aligned with these goals and were achieved despite a hostile Congress. The Agricultural Act of 1949 established new price supports for farmers, helping to stabilize food markets and sustain rural economies still adjusting from wartime production levels. The Housing Act of 1949 authorized the construction of over 800,000 units of low-income housing, a critical move amid a national housing shortage caused by returning GIs and the post-war baby boom. Equally notable was the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which marked a cautious humanitarian step. While heavily restricted by quotas and preferences for certain ethnic groups, the act nonetheless opened the door for thousands of European refugees, mainly Holocaust survivors, to resettle in the United States. A small but meaningful response to the humanitarian crisis in post-war Europe. Truman also succeeded in raising the minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents an hour through the Fair Labor Standards Act, and he expanded Social Security coverage to include millions more Americans, a key move towards Roosevelt's original vision of economic security for all citizens. But Truman's ambitions were often thwarted by a deeply resistant conservative coalition in Congress, a mix of Republicans and Southern Democrats who opposed expansive federal spending and civil rights initiatives. Truman famously labeled them the Do-Nothing Congress, a rhetorical jab he wielded throughout the 1948 campaign. And though they blocked many of his proposals, Truman's aggressive stance helped him politically. Truman's re-election prospects in 1948 seemed bleak. Opinion polls and newspapers had practically crowned Republican candidate Thomas Dewey the winner. Worse yet, the Democratic Party was fragmenting. Southern segregationists, enraged by Truman's executive order desegregating the armed forces and his call for civil rights in the party platform, broke off to form the States' Rights Democratic Party, or Dixiecrats, nominating South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond. From the left, Henry Wallace, a former vice president under FDR, ran as a Progressive Party candidate, opposing Truman's increasingly hardline foreign policy against the Soviets. Despite the Democratic Party fracturing in three, Truman campaigned relentlessly, embarking on a now legendary whistle-stop tour across the country. Speaking directly to working-class Americans, he framed the election as a choice between a president who fought for the common man and a do-nothing Congress beholden to wealthy interests. His energetic approach and populist messaging resonated, and in one of the greatest upsets in U.S. political history, Truman won a full term, preserving the New Deal coalition for a while longer. But it was foreign policy that would define Truman's presidency and mark the beginning of the Cold War. With the Soviet Union tightening its grip on Eastern Europe, tensions between the former wartime allies quickly turned to rivalry. Determined to stop the spread of communism, Truman embraced the policy of containment, articulated by diplomat George F. Kennan and eventually institutionalized in NSC 68, a 1950 document calling for a massive military buildup to counter Soviet aggression globally. The Truman Doctrine, first articulated in 1947, pledged that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to any country resisting communism. The immediate beneficiaries were Greece and Turkey, where American aid helped prevent communist movements from gaining control. This marked a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy, a commitment to intervene globally in the name of ideological containment. Even more impactful was the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948 and named after Secretary of State George Marshall. The program funneled more than $12 billion, over $130 billion in today's dollars, into rebuilding Western European economies, both to ward off communism and to stabilize the global economy. Though offered to all European nations, the Soviet Union refused the aid and blocked its satellite states from accepting it, creating a sharp divide between a recovering Western Europe and an economically stagnant Eastern Bloc. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill had described it, was becoming more real by the day. To bolster this new world order, the U.S. signed on to the Rio Pact, a hemispheric mutual defense treaty, and became a founding member of NATO in 1949, the first peacetime military alliance the U.S. had ever joined. Meanwhile, Truman recognized the new state of Israel in 1948, another decision that had lasting Cold War implications. Back home, Truman reorganized the American national security structure. The National Security Act of 1947 created several foundational institutions: the Department of Defense, replacing the old War Department, the National Security Council, or NSC, to advise the president, and most famously, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The CIA quickly became a covert tool of Cold War policy, engaging in espionage, psychological operations, and increasingly regime change in countries perceived to be leaning towards the Soviets. This was the new foreign policy framework: permanent global vigilance, anti-communist alliances, massive military readiness, and a growing intelligence state, all forged during Truman's presidency. The United States also supported the formation of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, or IMF, institutions designed to stabilize the global economy and prevent the kind of chaos that had led to fascism and war in the 1930s. Such institutions led to the groundwork for the New Liberal Order, a pro-globalization movement that sought out free trade and interconnectedness. Such actions fundamentally altered the U.S. economy, eliminating manufacturing in favor of service sector jobs. But still, it worked to enrich America and its globalist allies. The Cold War tensions first crystallized in the divided city of Berlin. Russia had kept all of the territory that it had possessed at the end of World War I. Having reached Hitler's bunker first, this meant that they lay claim to the eastern half of Germany. Although Berlin existed wholly within the communist side of East Germany, the two former allies agreed to divide the capital city. Although the Berlin Wall was later established, the two sides initially had an uneasy truce for the first 3 years after the war. But when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in 1948, cutting off all ground access, Truman refused to back down. Instead, American and British planes launched the Berlin airlift, supplying the city with basic goods, including food, toilet paper, and more, for almost a year until Stalin finally relented. Although it had only saved one half of a city, Truman's containment doctrine, at least for now, had succeeded. The next and perhaps first major test of America's Cold War resolve came in East Asia, and it would help define the logic of containment for decades to come. In June 1950, the Cold War turned hot. North Korean troops, heavily armed by the Soviet Union and trained in Stalinist tactics, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea, crossing the 38th parallel in an effort to reunify the peninsula under communist control. The South, an American-backed but politically fragile state, was caught off guard. Within days, Seoul, the capital, had fallen, and North Korean forces drove South Korea and American troops into a desperate retreat to the southeastern corner of the peninsula, a last-stand zone known as the Pusan Perimeter. The invasion shocked American policymakers. Truman, already committed to the idea of containment, saw the invasion not as a local conflict, but as a test of Western will by the global communist movement. Truman feared that if the U.S. failed to act, it might embolden Soviet or Chinese expansion elsewhere, particularly in Western Europe or Taiwan. In a dramatic and fast-moving sequence, the United Nations Security Council authorized a military response. Normally, the Soviet Union, one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, could have vetoed any such resolution. But in a twist of Cold War irony, the Soviets were boycotting the UN at the time to protest its refusal to seat Communist China in place of the nationalist government residing in Taiwan. Their absence allowed the resolution to pass, and a United Nations coalition, led overwhelmingly by American forces, intervened. At first, things looked bleak. U.S. and South Korean forces were outmanned and outgunned. But in September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, the famously bold and theatrical commander of UN forces, orchestrated a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. The operation was a logistical gamble. Tides, mudflats, and seawalls made it treacherous. But the gamble paid off. MacArthur's forces swiftly recaptured Seoul and cut off North Korean supply lines, forcing a dramatic reversal of the war's momentum. Now, with North Korean forces in retreat, the goal shifted from defending South Korea to reunifying the peninsula under non-communist rule. UN troops pushed north, past the 38th parallel, approaching the Yalu River, which marked the border with communist China. But that advance triggered a dangerous escalation. Despite repeated warnings from Mao Zedong, American leaders underestimated China's willingness to intervene. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer troops poured across the river, launching massive human wave attacks that shattered UN positions and pushed them into a chaotic winter retreat. The war had now become far more complicated and dangerous. General MacArthur urged Truman to expand the conflict into China itself. He called for bombing Chinese supply lines, blockading Chinese ports, and even hinted at the use of nuclear weapons. Truman, however, feared that widening the war could provoke a full-scale world conflict, possibly drawing in the Soviet Union, igniting World War III. When MacArthur publicly criticized Truman's restraint, going so far as to challenge civilian authority, Truman made the momentous and controversial decision to relieve MacArthur of command in April 1951. The move caused public outrage. MacArthur was a national hero, but it upheld the critical American principle of civilian control over the military. In a democracy, presidents, not generals, make final war decisions. After MacArthur's dismissal, the war settled into a grim and bloody stalemate along a fortified front near the original dividing line, the 38th parallel. Trenches, barbed wire, artillery, duels, and small-scale offensives defined the next 2 years. Diplomats haggled over ceasefire terms, even as soldiers continued to die in the hills of Korea. By 1952, public frustration was mounting. The war had become a grinding conflict with no clear end. General Dwight Eisenhower, running for president as a war hero and Republican candidate, promised to personally go to Korea and seek peace. After his election, and following the death of Stalin in March 1953, which softened the Soviet position, an armistice was signed in July 1953. It ended the fighting, but not the war itself. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war today, separated by the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a tense and heavily guarded strip of land that remains one of the most militarized borders on Earth. The Korean War had profound and lasting consequences. Nearly 36,000 American soldiers died in the conflict, alongside hundreds of thousands of Koreans and Chinese. The war cemented the Cold War logic that the United States must be prepared to intervene militarily anywhere communism threatened to spread, even without a formal declaration of war from Congress. This was a stark precedent, and one that would echo loudly in Vietnam. Politically, the war hardened American attitudes towards both China and the Soviet Union, ending any hope of early detente. It also militarized U.S. foreign policy. Defense spending ballooned, and America's global military presence expanded dramatically. At home, the Korean War helped justify the creation of permanent national security structures, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the NSA, as part of a peacetime war footing that would define the Cold War era. In short, the Korean War was not just a regional conflict. It was a turning point, the moment when Cold War rhetoric became Cold War reality. At home, while American soldiers were fighting in Korea and diplomats were crafting Cold War alliances abroad, another war raged inside the country's borders. It was fought not with bullets and bombs, but with suspicion, fear, and ideological purity tests. This was the Second Red Scare, and for a time, it dominated American life. The roots of this hysteria lay in real concerns. The Soviet Union, once an ally in World War II, had now become the enemy. It had developed the atomic bomb years earlier than most experts had predicted, in part because of espionage. China had fallen to communism in 1949. The Korean War had exploded into full-scale combat. Against this backdrop, many Americans became convinced that communists had infiltrated every level of American society, from the State Department to the schoolhouse, from labor unions to Hollywood. Fear turned inward, and suspicion became a national pastime. Leading the charge was Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin who rose from relative obscurity to national fame in 1950 when he claimed, without clear evidence, that he had a list of known communists working in the State Department. The number of names changed frequently, and McCarthy never produced definitive proof, but his accusations resonated. Americans, already anxious about international threats, turned their attention inward, terrified of a supposed fifth column of traitors in their midst. Congressional investigations ramped up. One of the most active bodies was the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had existed since 1930s but gained new energy during the Cold War. HUAC, as it was called witnesses to testify about their political affiliations, past or present. The entertainment industry became a major target, the fear being that writers, directors, and actors could use film and television to spread subversive ideas. The result was the Hollywood Blacklist, an unofficial ban that ruined careers. Those who refused to cooperate with HUAC, like the Hollywood 10, a group of screenwriters and directors, were cited for contempt of Congress and jailed. Others were pressured to name names of alleged communists, creating a climate of betrayal and paranoia. One of the most explosive cases of the era was that of Alger Hiss, a former high-ranking official in the State Department. He was accused of being a Soviet spy by Whittaker Chambers, a confessed former spy turned government witness. Although Hiss denied the charges and no direct evidence tied him to espionage, he was convicted in 1950, not for spying, but for perjury, for lying under oath about his past associations. Still, the case riveted the public and seemed to confirm that communists had indeed wormed their way into the U.S. government. It boosted the credibility of anti-communist crusaders and helped launch the political career of a young congressman named Richard Nixon, who had helped prosecute the case. But the most chilling moment came in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, secrets that helped the USSR build its own bomb, the Rosenbergs were convicted of espionage in 1951 and executed in 1953, despite global protests and doubts about the strength of the evidence, especially in Ethel's case. They remain the only American civilians executed for spying during the Cold War. For some, the Rosenbergs were traitors. For others, they were victims of Cold War paranoia and anti-Semitic hysteria. Either way, the case deepened the national mood of suspicion and fear. And the fear extended beyond communists. During the same period, the federal government launched what became known as the Lavender Scare. a campaign targeting LGBTQ+ individuals in the civil service. The logic was that homosexuals, already forced to live in secrecy, were more susceptible to being blackmailed by Soviet agents. Thousands of people lost their government jobs. Some were harassed, publicly humiliated, or even driven to suicide. This quieter purge mirrored the Red Scare in intensity and injustice, demonstrating how Cold War anxieties enabled the government to police not just political beliefs, but private lives. The government didn't just use intimidation, it turned fear into law. The Smith Act, passed in 1940 but used more aggressively during the Red Scare, made it a crime to advocate the violent overthrow of the government, or to belong to any group that did. The Communist Control Act of 1954 went further, banning the Communist Party entirely and making mere membership grounds for penalties. These laws undermined civil liberties and silenced dissent, all in the name of national security. But eventually, the Red Scare overreached. The man at its center, Joseph McCarthy, went too far. After years of smearing government officials, artists, academics, and even war heroes, McCarthy turned his attention to the one institution Americans revered most: the U.S. Army. In 1954, McCarthy began accusing Army officers and officials of harboring communists. This led to the Army-McCarthy hearings, which were televised nationally, allowing Americans to see McCarthy's tactics up close for the first time. They saw a man who bullied witnesses, shouted over responses, and made sweeping, unfounded claims. One moment in particular stunned the nation. When McCarthy attacked a young Army lawyer, Joseph Welch, Welch replied with the now famous line, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" That moment shattered McCarthy's image. Public opinion turned sharply against him. Later that year, the Senate voted to censure McCarthy for conduct unbecoming a senator, a rare and humiliating rebuke. He lost his committee assignments, his influence vanished, and he died a few years later a broken man, his once rising star extinguished. Rather than propelling him to the presidency, his witch hunt ended his career. Yet the damage to the nation had been done. The Second Red Scare left deep scars on American democracy. It stifled political debate, chilled freedom of expression, and emboldened the government to surveil its own citizens. For thousands of Americans, artists, teachers, bureaucrats, and activists, the Red Scare meant lost jobs, shattered reputations, and years of fear. In hindsight, the Second Red Scare reveals not only the intensity of Cold War paranoia, but also the fragility of civil liberties in times of national fear. It is a stark reminder that democracy must be guarded not just against foreign enemies, but against its own worst impulses. Even as fear gripped the nation, the 1950s witnessed an unprecedented economic boom. For many Americans, this was a decade of prosperity, stability, and upward mobility, so much so that economist John Kenneth Galbraith dubbed it the affluent society. Fueled by pent-up consumer demand, wartime savings, and massive government spending, particularly on defense, the U.S. economy expanded at a breakneck pace. Americans embraced a new culture of consumption, purchasing televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles, often on new lines of credit that made luxuries feel like necessities. The Cold War itself helped drive this prosperity. Military spending remained high, and the government poured money into research and infrastructure, creating jobs and fueling technological innovation. At the same time, the corporate landscape shifted. Small businesses gave way to massive conglomerates, and industries consolidated through mergers and acquisitions, giving rise to the modern multinational corporation. The age of big business had truly arrived. Labor, too, saw gains. Though the post-war years weren't without strikes and conflicts, unions became increasingly institutionalized. The AFL and CIO merged in 1955, creating a powerhouse that represented millions of workers. Union members secured rising wages, better benefits, and job security. Enough that for many Americans, even those not in a union, the labor movement helped establish a middle-class standard of living. Ironically, as prosperity became more widespread, union enrollment stagnated. Many workers felt they didn't need organized labor anymore, a sign of how successful the movement had been in reshaping expectations. This post-war affluence helped fuel the baby boom, as millions of returning GIs married and started families. From 1946 to 1964, over 76 million babies were born in the U.S., reshaping American demographics and culture. The federal government supported this transition with policies like the GI Bill, which gave returning veterans access to cheap college education and low-interest home loans. Developers responded by building entire suburban communities like Levittown, mass-produced with uniform houses, manicured lawns, and cul-de-sacs that offered families space, safety, and the promise of the American dream. That dream, however, came with its own limitations. Suburbs were largely segregated, both by law and by practice. Redlining, discriminatory mortgage policies, and exclusionary zoning ensured that most Black Americans and other minorities were shut out of the suburban boom. The idealized image of white picket fences was not available to all. Infrastructure boomed alongside suburbanization. The interstate highway system, championed by President Dwight Eisenhower and justified as a national defense strategy, a means to evacuate citizens in the case of a nuclear attack, further enabled suburban growth and car culture. It connected Americans like never before, while also contributing to the decline of urban centers and the growing dominance of automobile transportation. Culturally, the 1950s projected a powerful image of conformity and stability. Television emerged as the dominant medium, broadcasting idealized visions of suburban family life through shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Religion surged as well. In 1954, the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God We Trust" was adopted as the national motto. These were symbolic gestures that marked American identity as religious and opposed to the godless communism of the Soviet Union. Education, once a local and personal matter, took on national importance. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, a wave of anxiety swept the U.S. Not just about rockets, but about the brains behind them. American schools were seen as falling behind, and suddenly STEM education became a matter of national security. New investments in science, math, and even social studies followed, while many parents began pushing their children towards academic success with renewed intensity. The GI Bill helped millions of veterans attend college, dramatically increasing the number of educated Americans and reshaping the nation's intellectual landscape. But not everyone shared equally in this prosperity and progress. Women in particular found themselves pushed back into narrowly defined roles. During World War II, they had filled jobs in factories, offices, and the military, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. But by the 1950s, that independence was being reversed. Popular culture and public policy now revived the cult of domesticity. portraying the ideal woman as a devoted housewife whose fulfillment came from supporting her husband, raising children, and keeping a tidy home. Many women felt stifled by these expectations, a frustration that would surface more publicly in the 1960s. And even as the surface of 1950s life gleamed with new cars and tidy lawns, a cultural rebellion was brewing. While most Americans turned into TV sitcoms and attended church, a growing number of young people began to reject the rigid rules and buttoned-up values of Cold War conformity. This youth rebellion exploded most visibly through music, especially the rise of rock and roll. Musicians like Elvis Presley blended rhythm and blues with country to create a raw, provocative sound that electrified teenagers and horrified their parents. When Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, his performance, censored from the waist down to avoid showing his gyrating hips, became a national flashpoint in the generational culture war. His popularity symbolized a broader shift. Young Americans wanted to express themselves, and they weren't buying the sanitized version of life sold to them by advertisers and politicians. At the same time, a group of writers and thinkers known as the Beat Generation was quietly revolutionizing American literature and values. Figures like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs rejected materialism, celebrated spontaneity, and sought spiritual and personal liberation. Their works, including On the Road and Howl, were laced with drugs, jazz, travel, and raw emotion. The Beats challenged the dominant culture, not with marches or manifestos, but with art and lifestyle, setting the stage for the larger countercultural revolution of the 1960s. These cultural rebels were not political in the traditional sense, but their critique of conformity, consumerism, and repression carried radical implications. And they weren't alone in questioning the costs of post-war prosperity. In 1962, biologist and writer Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, a groundbreaking book that pulled back the curtain on one of the darker sides of American progress: environmental carnage. Carson focused on the widespread use of pesticides like DDT, which were killing birds, poisoning waterways, and threatening human health. Her writing was lyrical, but devastating, and she accused government and industry of prioritizing profit over ecological balance. The backlash was fierce. Critics called Carson a hysterical woman, a communist sympathizer, and an enemy of science. But her warnings resonated, particularly among middle-class Americans who had grown skeptical of unchecked economic growth. Silent Spring helped launch the modern environmental movement, and while its full impact would come in the 1970s, its publication marked a key moment in Cold War America, when progress began to be seen not just as a source of pride, but as a problem to solve. So while the 1950s are often remembered for their peace and prosperity, they were also a time of contradiction, of comfort and anxiety, of unity and rebellion, of growth and its growing pains. Beneath the chrome-plated surface of the American century were voices asking hard questions about gender, culture, conformity, sexuality, and the environment. The answers would shape the decades to come. As the 1950s gave way to the 60s, one thing was crystal clear. The Cold War was not cooling down. Despite moments of diplomatic outreach, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union remained dangerously high. What had begun in the aftermath of World War II as a battle of ideology and spheres of influence was evolving into a global high-stakes confrontation, one that reached into every corner of life, from geopolitics and military planning to education, science, and even pop culture. At the center of the standoff was a chilling new reality: the nuclear arms race. What had once been a race for military superiority had become something far more terrifying, a precarious balance based on the threat of total annihilation. This doctrine became known as mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was paradoxical, because both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to obliterate the other and potentially the entire planet. Neither side would risk launching a first strike. The result was a strange and uneasy peace, maintained not by trust or diplomacy, but by the certainty that any war would end in total catastrophe. MAD shaped nearly every aspect of Cold War strategy. It justified massive defense budgets, stockpiles of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and an ever-expanding nuclear triad: bombers, missiles, and submarines capable of delivering warheads across the globe in moments. It also impacted everyday life. American school children practiced duck and cover drills under their desks. Families built backyard fallout shelters. Civil defense literature distributed by the government tried to reassure citizens that survival was possible, even as the reality suggested otherwise. The Cold War was not only about geopolitics, it was about psychological warfare, fear, and the normalization of the unthinkable. Yet even with the logic of MAD theoretically preventing direct conflict, the Cold War still flared into moments of acute crisis. Moments when diplomacy broke down and the world teetered on the edge of disaster. One such flashpoint came in 1960 with the U-2 incident. A high-altitude American spy plane was shot down deep inside Soviet airspace while on a covert reconnaissance mission. The Eisenhower administration initially claimed it was a weather plane, but the Soviets revealed that they had both the wreckage and the pilot alive. The incident was a massive embarrassment for the US and a major blow to President Eisenhower's credibility, especially since it occurred just before a planned peace summit in Paris. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, outraged by the deception, walked out of the summit, shattering any immediate hopes for détente and reaffirming the deep distrust between the superpowers. But the Cold War wasn't just about the US and USSR staring each other down from opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. It was playing out across the globe, especially in regions newly emerging from colonial rule. In 1956, the Suez Crisis revealed just how much Cold War dynamics had reshaped global politics. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel responded with a surprise military invasion to retake the waterway. While the U.S. was no particular friend of Nasser's nationalistic ambitions, President Eisenhower was furious that America's closest European allies had acted without consulting Washington first. Eisenhower feared the move would alienate Arab nations and push them towards the Soviet bloc. Making matters worse, Khrushchev threatened to nuke London if the invasion didn't end. A classic example of brinksmanship, showing that both sides were willing to flirt with the edge of nuclear war to protect their interests. Under intense U.S. pressure, Britain, France, and Israel withdrew. The crisis not only signaled the decline of old European empires, but it also revealed the Cold War politics were now truly global, reaching into the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But nowhere did the Cold War come closer to open conflict than during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, arguably the most dangerous moment in human history. After the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Cuba, beneath the leadership of Fidel Castro, had grown increasingly close to the Soviet Union. In October 1962, American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missile installations under construction just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. President John F. Kennedy responded with a naval quarantine of the island to prevent further delivery of missile components. For 13 tense days, the world watched as the two nuclear superpowers inched dangerously close to war. Finally, a secretive diplomatic exchange produced a resolution. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw Soviet missiles from Cuba, while the U.S. pledged not to invade the island. And, in a secret concession, also agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but it left a lasting impression. The Cold War was volatile, unpredictable, and existentially dangerous. The Cold War's reach also extended to East Asia. In 1955, the Formosa Resolution passed by Congress committed the United States to defend Taiwan, then called Formosa, from any attack by Communist China. This was more than a regional issue. It demonstrated the growing scope of the American policy of containment, which now extended well beyond Europe to include Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Every perceived threat of communist expansion triggered a strategic response, often tying the U.S. into local conflicts with global implications. Meanwhile, a new frontier was opening up in the Cold War: outer space. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Its eerie beeping from orbit wasn't just a scientific marvel, it was a propaganda bombshell. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they might soon be able to launch intercontinental nuclear missiles with pinpoint accuracy. The American response was immediate. In 1958, the U.S. founded NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and began pouring money into aerospace research, science education, and technological innovation. The space race had begun, a peaceful, symbolic competition, but one that was rooted in very real fears about military supremacy and ideological dominance. All of these developments, from covert spy missions to intercontinental brinksmanship, from satellite launches to regional conflicts, reveal the multidimensional nature of the Cold War. It was not just a military standoff. It was a global ideological conflict that shaped foreign policy, science, education, economics, and culture. It created new alliances, intensified global instability, and transformed everyday life for millions of Americans. The Cold War during this era offers a powerful example of continuity and change. While the fundamental goal of containing communism remained steady, the methods, geography, and stakes of the conflict continued to evolve. And while leaders often spoke of peace and reason, the reality was that the world had entered a period in which total destruction was only minutes away, a terrifying legacy that would define the rest of the 20th century. One proxy war stands out above all the others, a conflict that would consume 2 decades of American attention, cost tens of thousands of lives, and leave deep scars on the American psyche. That war was Vietnam, and it came to define U.S. policy in the 60s and 70s. American involvement in Vietnam didn't start overnight. It was gradual, deliberate, and deeply rooted in Cold War ideology, particularly the theory of containment and the domino theory, the belief that if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, neighboring countries would soon follow. These ideas, embraced by both Democrats and Republicans, justified increasing U.S. commitment in the region. The story begins in the 1950s, following the defeat of French colonial forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. France's departure from Indochina created a vacuum, and in the Cold War worldview, vacuums were dangerous. They invited Soviet or Chinese expansion. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel into a communist north led by Ho Chi Minh and a non-communist south under the leadership of Diem, whom the US would come to support heavily despite his growing authoritarianism. Under President Dwight Eisenhower, the US began its involvement with what seemed a light footprint: military advisors, economic aid, and political support for Diem's regime. Eisenhower's administration promoted the Mutual Security Treaty with Southeast Asian nations and supported the creation of SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, a regional anti-communist alliance intended to mirror NATO in Europe. When John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited Eisenhower's commitment and doubled down. Believing deeply in Cold War competition, Kennedy increased the number of U.S. advisors from about 900 to over 16,000 by 1963. At the same time, Diem's government grew more corrupt and repressive, leading to instability and unrest. In November 1963, just weeks before Kennedy's assassination, the U.S. supported a coup that led to Diem's assassination, plunging South Vietnam into further political chaos. But it was under President Lyndon B. Johnson that the war truly escalated into full-scale American involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 was a pivotal moment. U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The details remain murky to this day. The second reported attack may never have happened, but Johnson used the incident to obtain congressional approval for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave him broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without an official declaration of war. Armed with this authorization, Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Simultaneously, he began deploying combat troops in massive numbers. What had started as a limited advisory role exploded into a full-blown confrontation. By 1968, over 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam. The fighting was brutal, confusing, and demoralizing. The Viet Cong, communist guerrilla fighters in the South, used hit-and-run tactics, booby traps, and underground tunnel networks. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex system of supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, allowed North Vietnam to continue supporting insurgents in the South despite heavy U.S. bombing. The U.S. military, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to the jungle. Traditional strategies proved ineffective against an enemy that could vanish or blend in with civilians. American soldiers often found themselves fighting a war where the enemy was everywhere, and yet nowhere all at once. As the war dragged on, public support began to unravel. Television brought the conflict into American living rooms, with images of napalm strikes, burning villages, and body bags fueling a growing anti-war movement. The village of Ben Tre was annihilated, with commanders explaining that they had to destroy the village in order to save it, while My Lai devolved into an actual war crime, with Lieutenant William Calley being sentenced to hard labor. College campuses erupted with protests, draft cards were burned, and thousands of young men dodged the draft by fleeing to Canada or seeking deferments. Then came 1968, a turning point. During the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, or Tet, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched a massive surprise attack, the Tet Offensive. It happened across dozens of cities and military installations in South Vietnam. While U.S. forces eventually repelled the offensive and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, the sheer scale and audacity of the attacks shocked the American public. The Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that victory was near and marked a decisive psychological blow to U.S. confidence. Support for Johnson's war efforts plummeted. He announced he would not seek re-election in 1968, a stunning decision from a sitting president. That fall, Richard Nixon won the presidency, campaigning on a promise of peace with honor. But the war didn't end quickly under Nixon either. Instead, Nixon pursued a strategy known as Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while expanding support and training for South Vietnamese forces. At the same time, he escalated the war in secret by ordering the bombing of Cambodia and Laos, attempting to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and pressure North Vietnam into negotiating. These secret bombings, once revealed, triggered massive public outrage. As Nixon negotiated with North Vietnamese leaders, the anti-war movement at home grew louder and more confrontational. Groups like the Yippies, Youth International Party, protested the war with satire and disruption, while the broader counterculture movement of hippies, artists, and students made opposition to the war a moral and cultural rallying cry. The shootings at Kent State University in 1970 and later at Jackson State, where National Guardsmen killed student protesters, showed just how divided and volatile America had become. Finally, after years of negotiations and more bloodshed, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, formally ending U.S. combat involvement. But it was a fragile peace. In 1975, just 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, and the Vietnam War ended in a communist victory, an outcome that many Americans had fought so hard to prevent. The legacy of Vietnam was profound. More than 58,000 Americans had died, and countless more were wounded or traumatized. Trust in the government was shattered, particularly after the release of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that U.S. leaders had misled the public about the war's progress. The war also left a deep cultural scar, inspiring films, literature, and a generation of veterans who returned home to a nation uncertain of how to receive them. In the larger Cold War narrative, Vietnam was a turning point. It showed the limits of military power in a global ideological struggle. It exposed the dangers of mission creep and uncritical reliance on the domino theory. And it made future American presidents, from Ford to Carter and even Reagan, far more cautious about committing troops abroad. The fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the end of America's long nightmare in Vietnam. But while the United States licked its wounds, the Cold War raged on, and before long, the tables would turn. That was because in 1979, the Soviet Union blundered into its own quagmire, a war that many in the U.S. foreign policy establishment came to see as Russia's Vietnam. Because in 1979, the Soviet Union blundered into its own quagmire, a war that many in the U.S. foreign policy establishment came to see as Russia's Vietnam. It was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a brutal conflict that would drain Soviet resources, demoralize its military, and ultimately contribute to the unraveling of the Soviet Union itself. Afghanistan had long been a politically fragile state, balancing tribal dynamics, monarchies, and Cold War pressures. In 1978, a communist faction known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in a coup, launching radical land reforms and a campaign of secularization. These policies sparked fierce resistance from traditional Afghan society, particularly among conservative rural populations and Islamic clerics. The Democratic Party of Afghanistan's internal divisions and heavy-handed repression made the situation worse. Rebel groups, collectively called the Mujahideen, rose up across the country. Alarmed by the growing instability on its southern flank, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, hoping to prop up the communist regime and secure Soviet influence in the region. It was a massive miscalculation. The Soviet military soon found itself mired in a guerrilla war, not unlike what the United States had experienced in Vietnam. The Mujahideen knew the terrain, enjoyed local support, and fought with unrelenting religious and nationalist fervor. The Soviets, for all their firepower and tanks, were ill-prepared for the mountainous geography and decentralized enemy. To the United States, the invasion was an opportunity. Still stung by the humiliation in Vietnam, American policymakers now saw a chance to bleed the Soviets dry, just as the U.S. had been bled. Under President Jimmy Carter and later expanded by Ronald Reagan, the U.S. began covertly funneling weapons, supplies, and training to the Mujahideen through Operation Cyclone, one of the most expensive and sustained CIA programs of the Cold War. The U.S. worked closely with Pakistan's intelligence service, and funding also came from Saudi Arabia, blending anti-communism with a rising tide of Islamic resistance. This wasn't just a Cold War chess move. It was a proxy war with global implications. The U.S. supplied Stinger missiles, allowing the Mujahideen to shoot down Soviet helicopters and shift the battlefield dynamics. Meanwhile, American rhetoric shifted. Ronald Reagan famously labeled the Mujahideen freedom fighters, holding meetings with Afghan resistance leaders and portraying their struggle as a part of the larger fight for liberty against totalitarianism. But the cost to Afghanistan was staggering. Villages were destroyed, millions of civilians were killed or displaced, and the country became a patchwork of warring factions. By the mid-1980s, the war had become a grinding stalemate, and morale within the Soviet military plummeted. Casualties mounted, and at home, the Soviet public began questioning the purpose and cost of the war. This was the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a conflict that exposed the limits of its power, undermined its global image, and added fuel to internal dissent in the wake of Chernobyl. By 1989, after a decade of fighting, the Soviet Union finally withdrew, its goals unmet and its prestige badly damaged. The Mujahideen celebrated, but peace would remain elusive. The war had created a generation of militant fighters, many of whom would go on to influence future conflicts, including the rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. For the United States, the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan was seen as a strategic victory. But like many Cold War battles, its long-term consequences would prove far more complicated. Back home, Americans' faith in their government was deeply shaken by the war, by scandals like Watergate, and by the economic stagnation of the 1970s. As the 1980s dawned, a new chapter of the Cold War was about to begin, one in which Ronald Reagan would label the communists the evil empire, before working with Gorbachev to ensure a safe landing for the fall of the former foe.